Hello and welcome to the Origins of Islam. After having a look at the history of the Templemount, today we want to look at what I call the shrine archetype. But instead of giving a long primer at this point, let me just jump straight into our presentation. During the 14th century, Islamic scholar and explorer Ibn Battuta wrote about the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock is a building of extraordinary beauty, solidity, elegance, and singularity of shape. Today, we know that the dome was of course not singular at all. It rather follows a long tradition of very similar buildings. The peculiar thing about the Dome of the Rock is that it's not a mosque. It is not built to house a large group of praying believers. Rather, it is built to house the rock in its center, giving believers the opportunity to circumambulate said rock. So let's look at other examples of similar buildings. Maybe we can deduce some things that may be relevant for the interpretation of the Dome of the Rock. Let's start with something that's a bit of an outlier, a church which does not really fit the mold because it's not round. Yet there are some similarities as well, which is why I chose to put it in this list. I'm talking about the Church of All Nations in Gethsemane at the foot of the Mount of Olives. The church as it stands today was only built in 1924, but in its place used to be a precursor in ancient times, built sometime during the 4th century. It houses the rock on which Jesus is said to have prayed before his arrest. Next on our list, not an octagon, but one of the earliest predecessors, Santa Constanza was built by Constantine the Great as a mausoleum for his daughters Constantina and Helena. Here we already see a shrine in the center of the drum, surrounded by an arcade, similar to the Dome of the Rock. With Constantina later being revered as a saint, the mausoleum was first transformed into a baptistery and later into a church. Speaking of baptisteries, here we have the Lateran Baptistery in Rome, built around 440 AD by Pope Sixtus III. We can already see the octagonal shape of the arcade with a raised central drum. It was built on top of a pre-existing structure and was believed to be the place where Constantine the Great was baptized. Today it is connected to the Archbasilica of St. John Lateran, but originally it was standing free. The interior, however, has been heavily modified during the Renaissance period under Pope Urban VIII. Again, under Constantine the Great, the original Church of the Nativity was built in Bethlehem around 333 AD. A defining feature was the octagonal structure in the east, built on top of the place where Mary was believed to have given birth to Jesus. A very obvious influence on the Dome of the Rock is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, particularly the so-called Anastasis, the dome above Jesus' grave. Consecrated in 335 AD, the Anastasis has the typical ambulatory around the central shrine. On the left you can see a reconstruction of how the church may originally have looked like. But to be honest, it's probably not the best reconstruction, particularly the fact that the ambulatory is cut off here, something which originally probably wasn't the case. On the right we have one of the oldest floor plans from around 670 AD. Another template for the Dome of the Rock was the Church of the Ascension, originally built before 378 AD. It had an octagonal plan with exterior walls surrounding a space divided by a ring of columns. In its center was the rock with footprints of Jesus Christ from where he was believed to have ascended into heaven, hence the name of the church. The church was destroyed by the Persians in 614 AD, but later rebuilt after the Byzantine Sassanid War. Bishop Alculfus, who made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem around 670 AD, described it as follows. Quote, "A great round church having in its circuit 3 vaulted porticos covered over above. The interior of the church without roof or vault lies open to heaven under the open air." The second church was however also destroyed, and during the 12th century the Crusaders rebuilt it as a new church, which was no longer a single building as in Byzantine times, but also octagonal in shape and essentially a central shrine or edicule surrounded by a fortified monastery. Under Saladin, this structure was also destroyed, and what is left today is the central octagonal shrine built by the Crusaders. Next we have an interesting archaeological site in Capernaum. Here we have another octagonal structure. Today, a modern Catholic church perched on 8 sturdy pillars hovers protectively over the excavation site. It is believed to have been the site of St. Peter's house, where Jesus would have lodged. Archaeologists believe the house was in a small complex grouped around irregular courtyards. Excavations show that one room in this interlinked complex had been singled out since the middle of the 1st century. Graffiti scratched on its plaster walls referred to Jesus as Lord and Christ. It is suggested that this room was venerated for religious gatherings as a house church. If so, it would have been the first such example in the Christian world. In the 5th century, an octagonal dome was built around this venerated room. The present church, dedicated in 1990, repeats the octagonal shape. Now, in 1992, in a surprise discovery, the remains of the church of the Katisma were identified between Jerusalem and Bethlehem during the construction of Highway 60. The course of the highway was shifted to avoid damage to the site. We do, however, have 5th century sources for this church. It was the earliest church dedicated to Mary in the Holy Land. Like the Domeoftherock and the Ascension Church on the Mount of Olives, the church of the Katisma has 3 shells. The outer shell started out as an ambulatory but was converted to house various chapels in order to accommodate more pilgrims. But what was this church all about? Why was it built? The reason is that in the center of the church of the Katisma there is a rock on which Mary is believed to have rested on her way to Bethlehem, as described in the Proto-Evangelium of James. During the early 8th century, a prayer niche oriented towards the south was added, typically interpreted as a Muslim mihrab. However, at the same time, a mosaic floor with Christian inscriptions and adorned with crosses was added as well. This is typically interpreted as indicating a dual use for the church by both Muslims and Christians. But either way, it seems like there was no reason which prevented Saracens and Christians from using the same holy space. Maybe at that time they still weren't so different after all. And indeed, we do have many parallels in both Islamic and Christian sources. For example, the miraculous feeding of Mary from the Proto-Evangelion of James can also be found in the Quran in Surah 3, verse 32, leading many historians to believe that this story has a Christian origin. However, in the Quran, the story of Mary's labor pains from the Proto-Evangelion of James is merged with the birth of Jesus in Surah 3, verse 23 to 26. There, Mary leans against a palm tree. Floor mosaics of palm trees in the church of the Katisma have caused archaeologists to speculate that this was also believed to be the place where Mary leaned on the palm tree and hence the birthplace of Jesus according to some traditions. Another example is the church Mary Theotokos, which was built by Emperor Zeno on Mount Gerizim around 490 AD. It is located in a spot where a major Samaritan temple used to stand. Or rather, it was the Samaritan temple. As you probably know, the main difference between Jews and Samaritans was a disagreement over where to worship God. For the Jews, it was obviously the Templemount in Jerusalem. For the Samaritans, it was the temple on Mount Gerizim. The interesting bit about this octagonal church was that in its center, it housed a piece of the Rock of Calvary, surrounded by 2 ambulatories. On the right you can see an artist's rendition of how the building may have looked like. Of course, there is a lot of speculation in that reconstruction, given that we only have the remnants of the walls. On these 2 pictures you can see possible reconstructions of the Martyrian church in Caesarea, built around 500 AD. As the name indicates, a martyr was lying at the center of the dome. Unfortunately, we do not know who the martyr was. Okay, so these were a few examples of very similar buildings with very similar functions. So what can we say about the shrine archetype, which underlies all the examples we looked at today? First of all, in every case we are looking at a place with some religious significance around which a shrine was built. Typically either a tomb of a martyr or a saint, or very often also a rock. On top of this significant place, a dome was constructed and around that dome an ambulatory. The 3 shell structure with 2 ambulatories surrounding the central dome only exists in the Holy Land, and most of the examples are found in Jerusalem. These are distinctly Christian types of buildings. Neither Jews nor Saracens built anything like it, either in form or in function. And if you remember, when we previously looked at the inscriptions inside the Domeoftherock, we saw that they are all about Christology, leading us to the conclusion that a Christian origin is at least plausible, if not likely. What's more, as we've now seen, the Dome of the Rock stands in a direct line with these uniquely Christian structures. It has a raised dome, a 3-shell structure, the outer walls have an octagonal shape, and there is a sacred rock at its center. This observation further strengthens the hypothesis that it was a Christian sect which was responsible for the construction of the Dome of the Rock, a sect which over time evolved into what we now know as Islam. Well, that is the end for today. In the next video, we will have a look at the significance of the Dome of the Rock itself and why it was deemed important enough to build this dome around it. Spoiler alert, it wasn't the Mirage, the mythical night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem, which Muhammad is supposed to have undertaken. And with that, thank you very much for watching and see you next time.